Ladies, gentlemen, I am happy and even more than happy to meet you this morning in Europe or Africa, this evening in Middle East, India and Asia, and this morning in Americas, when I am presently. I am more than happy to meet you, but is the topic really important? Since years, we are hearing that transmission is not anymore at the core of electricity systems. We have decentralization with self-generation, self-consumption, mini-grids, microgrids. We have flexibility with EVs, with storage. Do we really still live in an electrical world with two levels, a local level with local issue and a central level with central issues? That's a question. Or are we entering a new era, which is the end of grid neglect in energy transition? We have heard the voice of IEA, International Energy Agency, a few days ago. Not more grids, not more guarantee for energy transition. The voice of the European Commission or even the European industry. It's a new priority. You have to consider, you have to implement. If you do not do, we are blocked. Even the voice of the UK government claiming that already today, UK is blocked by the lack of grids. Or the voice of the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the government said last week or the week before, sorry guys, we think that we are to end universal access to the grids because we lack grids for energy transition. But are US the same like EU? It's not obvious. I'm presently in Chicago. Which Chicago up to you? The Chicago of Chicago boys, Milton Friedman, or the Chicago of Chicago Law School, Ronald Coase. Choose the Chicago I am in, but I am in the USAEE, the American chapter for energy economics conference. And I heard, no, US is not EU, EU dreams, US works to deliver. Well, we will see, no problem. To discuss the issue, we have with us Ben Hobbs. Ben is Prof at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, but on the top, he is the chair of the Market Surveillance Committee at Californian ISO. So he knows firsthand on the topic. Second, we have with us Astrid Brunt, General Counsel for International and European Affairs at Statnett, the Norwegian electricity transmission grid. Very important, Norway, the EU, because they are European, but they are not inside the European Union. They have an independent voice. And then you have me, the experienced dreamer. In any country of the world, I can quietly dream because I am the president of IAEE, the International Association for Energy Economics. The privilege is that I have one pillow in every country of the world, plus one on the moon. Now, we are going to hear from Ben Hobbs. Ben, you have the floor. And just after Ben, Astrid will discuss with Ben. Ben, it's your time.
You can hear me all right?
Unfortunately, yes.
But malheureusement. So, good afternoon. I especially want to thank Jean-Michel and Astrid for joining me today. But I also want to thank FSR, who is hosting my sabbatical visit this fall, and also thank my colleagues at the Future Power Markets Forum of Columbia University and Johns Hopkins for the many discussions on transmission we've had. I will single out for particular blame my former Federal Energy Regulatory Commission colleague, Rob Gramlich, who helps to run the forum with me. His writings on transmission are something that I strongly recommend to you if you're, if after this hour, your appetite for US transmission policy is not completely satisfied. Also, I should thank Jean-Michel and Leo, who helped to introduce me to EU power markets and transmission processes when I visited them many years ago in their monk cells, and I literally mean monk cells, in the Dominican monastery here. That was the first location for the Florence School of Regulation. It has long outgrown those facilities, but we have fond memories of those cells and the apple orchards there. Okay, so what is the transmission problem? And let me share the screen here. Hopefully this will work. So there are two reasons why we worry a lot about the grid in the United States. One is the simple matter of keeping the lights on. So this figure, thanks to Rob, shows what happened during Winter Storm Uri in 2021, when the Texas grid was shut down, frozen out. At that time, however, in my home state of South Dakota and this area of the Midwest, no lights went out because the grid of the Mid-Continent ISO was capable of bringing 13 gigawatts from the east, from PJM, to the west. It was not capable of doing that to Texas because Texas, in their wisdom, has chosen to have very weak connections with the rest of the country. So reliability is one very important issue in the US. And the other need is to facilitate the transition. We've got all this wind and solar, but not all in the right places to meet load. So we have to figure out a way of moving that from where the resources are abundant to where the people are abundant. And here's an example of a macro grid that we designed at Johns Hopkins. And there are, you can look at the work by Jesse Jenkins and many other people who've talked about the need for large-scale interregional transmission to bring large amount of renewables to load. Jesse's study, which I particularly recommend, estimates that if you don't triple the amount of investment in the grid over the next 10 or 15 years, that most of the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of the renewables that are built will not be realized, neither the economic nor the environmental benefits. So it's important for reliability and important for of course, making the transition. I'll talk about three particular problems that we face in managing and expanding the grid. And those problems are the congestion. We can't move power around on the present grid. Something called interconnection queues, which I understand is not such a problem in Europe, where people who want to build the facilities cannot connect them. Although, Jean-Michel, you did mention that the headache in the Netherlands right now, at least on the distribution level, with interconnections, which is not dissimilar. And then finally, we are, for some reason, having a pause in our race to build new transmission, interregional transmission in the US. I'll talk about all three of those problems. And here's the first one, congestion. So what this figure shows is the average absolute value of price differences between different hubs in the US. And these represent opportunities for gains from trade, which are unrealized either because the connections simply don't exist, like between ERCOT, Texas, and the rest of the US, or they're very constrained. And what's happened is that from the previous decade until very recently, these cost differences have, in places, more than doubled. And there are some easy reasons for this. One is, of course, the increase in energy prices and the fact that there are not enough wires. But I want to point out about that last reason. In theory, You could build your way out of this problem. You could build a copper plate. But I have to remind you, any of you who've studied electrical or civil engineering know that the success story of infrastructure engineering in the last half century is our smarter management of our transport systems, water, pipelines, and energy infrastructure. We've squeezed an amazing amount of services and value out of the existing networks and the expansions that we have made without huge investments and the associated environmental and financial damage. This has been a big lesson of the half century. And I think it's something that will help us in the next half century to deal with these problems. We don't have to build a copper plate. I don't think we're going to have to triple the size of the grid. And there are two reasons for this. Perhaps you've had a child who's asked you for a new toy. And have you ever replied to this child, well, first you need to take care of the toys that you have and use them. This is true with the grid now. We are not using the grid well today, and there's a lot of things that we could do to get a lot more value of it. Now, I recently became a grandfather, and I realized that I can't ever say that to a grandchild. That's a different matter entirely, but I digress. So I'm optimistic for two reasons. We're going to get a lot more out of the existing grid and the investments we do make, first by deploying smart grid technologies and co-optimizing the grid with other ways of moving power around, with non-wires alternatives, storage, flow control, topology control, dynamic line ratings, demand response, reconductoring existing corridors. So Jessica Lau of NREL and I have described a number of these in our recent report on research priorities at DOE, for which there's a link in my bio in the reminder that you got, I believe. The second reason is that we have opportunities to dispatch over larger areas. In the West, we have about 40 balancing authorities. In the Eastern United States, we have another 40. And then there's the People's Republic of Texas, which stands gloriously by itself. So 81 approximately control areas, which have not historically coordinated at all well their operations or their investments. So there's some hope on the horizon. This shows a map of the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which the California ISO, for whom I work as a chair of the Market Surveillance Committee, full disclosure, has created a 20 balancing authority, centrally dispatched balancing market. And I understand that Europe is also heading in the same direction. Europe moved first with a continent-wide day-ahead market. For some reason, in the United States, we started with a balancing market. And soon, we're going to have a continent-wide day-ahead market. And I understand Europe will have a continent-wide balancing authority as well. There are so many efficiencies we'll get from centralized unit commitments, and then also from evaluation of investments. EIM has saved roughly $500 million a year in each of the last 8 years, and the savings from EDAM, the extended day-ahead market, which is now being created by the California ISO, will be, we hope, an order of magnitude larger. Okay, so that's one problem, that congestion, which I think that we have a handle on and will improve in the future. Let me talk about the second problem, which is something called the interconnection queue. Okay, here we go. And I understand this is an unfamiliar notion in Europe, but here's the US nightmare. We have 2 terawatts of new supply that's waiting to be interconnected. That's 1.5 times as much existing capacity as we have in the United States. Furthermore, instead of taking 2 years to interconnect it as it has in the past, it's now taking up to 5 years. And the cost is going up from $100 to kW to $500 to sometimes as much as $1,000 per kW. So what is the cause of this transmission constipation? Well, the problem is the U.S. manner of planning interconnections. They are evaluated one facility at a time. Can we deliver the power, considering all the other applications? And if then somebody else withdraws their application, you have to redo the study. It is a horrible mess, and it is a waste of our engineers' time. And we simply, this is probably the biggest obstacle to the transition right now. So how, and of course, having tight transmission capacity makes this worse. So this is like planning a road system by starting with at the house and saying, do we need to widen the driveway? And then do we need to widen the street? And then do we need to build a new highway? You would never plan a transportation system that way, but that's how we're planning our transmission system in terms of generator interconnection. So what we should be doing instead is simultaneously planning transmission along with all of the generation, looking at all the applications and making decisions about which ones will be accepted and which ones won't. So at the risk of being a little immodest, here's an example of the sort of tool that can be used for that, that's starting to be used in the US. We developed this in the UK and have used it in the West and the East. It is a co-optimization model for generation and transmission investment. A simple version of this might co-optimize under a single future scenario, but in fact, we have huge economic, political, technological uncertainties. So instead of planning under one future, we need to plan considering multiple scenarios. You're the goalie. The ball may come to your right. The ball may come to your left. Where's the optimal place for you to be in the goal? You need to recognize the adaptability of the system, that depending on what happens in the future, we may put lines in one place or another place. So tools to do this, called stochastic programming, exist. And as an example, in the Western United States, this is a deterministic solution, co-optimizing generation transmission. And here is a solution that considers the value of diversification and creating options. And in this case, you add a lot more transmission and you get 50% more net benefits when you average them over the scenarios. So anyway, these tools should be put to use, which brings me to the third problem. We are not building stuff the way that we used to. And why is that? Rob likes to talk about the 3 Ps that are needed to build. So you need to plan, you need to get permits, and you need to figure out a way to pay for it. And one difficulty is that in these large systems, independent system operators, with some rare exceptions, MISO, the California ISO, in some cases, do not use systems-based methods to consider where generation might be built. That's called proactive planning. Multiple objectives. They do not consider multiple scenarios. So they're using poor tools that will waste money and slow things up. We also have permitting problems. And of course, you all know about the nightmares there. If you try to build one facility that benefits a different state, you're in trouble. And a solution to that is regional planning, such as what the Mid-Continent ISO championed, where you look at the whole system at once, as I did in the previous slide, and then the Midwest ISO proposed 17 lines, benefited nearly everybody, and it got 16 of them permitted. Permitting is easier if everybody sees some benefits. Getting people to agree to pay for them is also easier. So this is not just a dream, but in fact, we have been able to build transmission in the past. Whether President Kennedy building the West Coast DC intertie, the same time he sent a man to the moon, or 10 years ago, the Mid-Continent ISO in California, and elsewhere in the US, Texas building a lot of transmission 10 years ago, but now with higher interest rates, with the decrease in natural gas prices that I know will make Europe a little bit jealous, and a variety of other reasons, we are no longer building it the way we used to, and we need to turn that around. And the way that's going to be turned around is if the federal government, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which Rob and I used to work for many years ago, takes some leadership, requires regional planning, perhaps requires regional interconnection, as Europe does, and shows through leadership how this can be done and be successful, and perhaps champions tax credits. So here are the lessons that I might say that you might take away from the US. We've done some things horribly wrong, such as generator interconnection. But one lesson is, and actually I know that Europe is very familiar with this too, building your way out of a problem never works. It's unaffordable and it's environmentally damaging. You do need more investment, but you also need smart management with markets across wide areas and grid-enhancing technologies. That's the only way it's going to happen. You see from our experience that piecemeal grid extension to interconnect new supply is a disaster. And we absolutely need to fix that. And I gather that you don't have this problem with generation at the bulk transmission level yet. But as Jean-Michel mentioned with the Netherlands, it is a problem in the distribution level with distributed resources and with new customers. And a regional approach is absolutely essential for that. And so finally, it has been said about the US that the US is far more Balkanized than Southeastern Europe. With our 81 balancing authorities that don't coordinate, we operate inefficiently, we plan inefficiently, and as a result, we're going to waste a lot of money and not get all the environmental benefits we ought to out of transition. And we need federal leadership to encourage a regional approach. And the European approach is definitely some inspiration for us. Okay, thanks, Jean-Michel. I hand this back to you and to Astrid.
I'm not saying anything because Astrid has all the skills and experience needed to dialogue with you. Astrid.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. There was a lot of food for thought here, Ben, and we have to start somewhere. I think one place to start is when you discuss the change that's now happening, and you talk about the interaction between
we have to be patient because we are connecting Italy, Chicago, and Norway, and sometimes it blocks. It's unfortunate, but it happens.
Can you hear me now, Jean-Michel?
Yeah, you are back.
I'm so sorry. So should I repeat what I said? I said
everything, yeah?
Yeah. So this is very interesting and lots of food for thought. When you discuss the development of the grid, I understand that you say that we have to develop it smart, and you talked about interaction between production and grid. And I was just wondering about the customer, because in some of the European discussions, they discuss the future system where you maybe have to have a more consumer-centric focus than you've had before, sort of looking at the demand and what the demand can contribute into the new system where you have more intermittency in the production. Do you have any thoughts about that from the American perspective?
Thanks very much, Astrid, for that question. So we all realize that we have half a market. That is, we have a market on the supply side, but to a large extent, consumers are not engaged on the demand side of the market, especially in the day-ahead real-time markets. Some markets are doing better than others. I know that the Scandinavian markets, for example, have active day-ahead pricing and active involvement by many of its consumers. This is not merely a matter of economic efficiency, that demand management can help, is one additional arrow in our quiver to deal with the problem of congestion. It's literally a matter of life and death. 200 people died in Texas during the February 2021 event, and that was because that most of the utilities in Texas do not have either the sensors or the controls to for demand automation. And so when they had rotating blackouts, they simply opened up the breaker for distribution feeders and blacked out entire sections of the city for many hours at a time. They couldn't do anything more fine-grained. And this is a matter of life and death, because under the temperatures that we experienced then, many people lost their water supplies, lost their heat, and died as a result. So technologies are needed for controlling distribution systems at a much finer scale, and for also, instead of doing things bang bang, either you're connected or you're not, to be able to modulate, to be able to provide a lifeline of power for essential uses, while still limiting, collaring the amount of power that's used, so it can be spread out. So I'm focusing here mainly on the consequences of severe capacity shortages, which I understand that at least in Europe, you've been very lucky not to have had, like unfortunately, like we have had. But these sorts of technologies, dialed down a little bit, can also be incredibly helpful for managing flows and distribution systems and on the high voltage grid. And it's if we go back to Saint Fred Schweppe of MIT, of Cambridge, who, when he first thought about using prices to coordinate actions on the grid in the 1970s, he thought first of doing that with demand, and then it was only later that he and his students said, oh, we could also use price to coordinate generation. And I think it's such a shame that his vision of providing incentives for consumers to participate in the short-term management of the grid, that his vision has, here we are 45 years on, and it's still not anywhere close to being realized.
When you talk about the grid, you say we shouldn't build more than we need to have, and that overinvestment is maybe a risk. And then you have a concept you talked about in anticipative planning. Can you say something more about how you think about sort of the right level of investment on grid? I guess it should be just the right volume and the right timing to keep the lights on, the reliability, and also affordability. Can you see something more about these thoughts you have about the planning for the grid?
So the question is the Goldilocks. When is the porridge too hot and when is it too cold? What is the right amount? We know that you should never build a church for Easter Sunday, that otherwise the other 364 days the church will be nearly empty. There should always be it's always optimal to have some congestion. Otherwise you're wasting money building things you don't need. And I know this is a particular issue in Europe, and it certainly is in the United States, the environmental impacts of stringing lines across the landscape is a very serious one. When I had my first job in the power industry, which was actually 49 years ago in Connecticut, the biggest environmental issue in the state was the landscape impacts of overhead transmission lines. And people got very upset about that, and I think rightly so. Actually, my first job was to look at the water quality impacts of clearing land for right-of-ways. These impacts are serious, and so having a copper plate may look nice from an electric power point of view, but it's a waste economically and environmentally. Now, how do you think about the right level of that? There's a methodology shown in one of my slides called the California ISO team methodology, and it's good planning practice. You balance the cost of investments, the cost of operations. You either put in constraints or a weight for environmental effects, and there's an optimal level of congestion. There's no doubt we're going to have congestion in the future. We'll never get rid of it, and we shouldn't get rid of it. I happen to think that with smarter congestion management, that is, wider markets to take advantage of the diversity of load and the diversity of resources, and then with flexible AC transmission technologies, dynamic line ratings, dynamic topology, which I understand is actually something that Europe also uses. We can accommodate a lot more flows than we do now, especially if you do this over a wider area. The optimal level, I think, is something that you need modeling and benefit cost analysis for. And in a future where loads are more flexible, for example, we use the thermal mass of our homes as virtual batteries. As the cost of demand response goes down, as the inconvenience and discomfort costs go down, perhaps we should be living with a lot more congestion because the social costs it will impose will be less. But this is something that we should, of course, proceed carefully on with experimentation. I think it bears watching what's happening in the Netherlands and the UK for their flexibility and congestion management of the distribution grid to see if that can be accomplished without either discomfort or loss of life or yellow vests.
Astrid?
Yes, very interesting. So you talk about this rapid change with the change of the production and the change with the new technology. Do you have any thoughts about how we can make these things into use? One thing is to have further research and further thoughts and thinking 30 years ahead. But for the challenges the industry is facing today, like you mentioned, the Netherlands, UK, I think also in Norway, to some extent, there is not enough capacity. We have huge grid development plans, both at the distribution grid and the transmission level, to meet electrification of society, to meet the new industries. Like IEA shows that the consumption and the electrification will be much higher. So we need more reliable power because more things are dependent on, everything is dependent now on electricity, and things are turning. So what are your thoughts about making use of the new knowledge and the digitalizations in practical life of today?
So I guess there are two answers I would give. One is the economic incentives for utilities that are regulated, who are often focused more on cost recovery than on innovation and improving effectiveness. And then the other part of the answer is the new generation. The students that I have in my classes are getting into this field, not for the reasons that maybe my generation did in the 60s and 70s, which is, oh, this is a job that you can have for 40 years and you get a nice pension. But rather because they say this is important for society, for sustainability, for human needs. And there are very exciting technological challenges that innovation did not stop with Tesla, Westinghouse, and Edison. But in fact, things are changing very rapidly, and this is an exciting area. So I have a lot of confidence in the young people that are in my classes and my young colleagues here at the Florence School of Regulation that they will help a lot. So let's go back to incentives. And incentives truly do matter. You perhaps may know of the sad story of the prisoner ships that went to Australia from Great Britain, and the very high levels of mortality, 10, 20, sometimes 30% on those ships when they first went in the 1700s. And this was, of course, a moral outrage, but moral outrage didn't change that. What did change it is that somebody hit upon the idea, well, let's pay them for the number of prisoners who arrive alive and in good health, rather than pay them for the number of prisoners that get on board back in Great Britain. I mean, this sounds really heartless, but in fact, the mortality rates fell by a factor of 10 to the 1, 2, or 3%, rather than 10, 20, or 30%. People respond to incentives. And whether we're talking about carbon emissions or we're talking about building and operating the grid effectively, I think there's a lot that can be done. In the United States, we tend to simply put capital expenditures into a rate base and reimburse operating expenses. And that's a terrific incentive for gold plating a system, but not an incentive for efficiency. We take some inspiration from the work of, for example, people like Michael Pollitt at Cambridge, which has been done in the EU in terms of incentive-based regulation. And I think these are tools, and the things that are measured and the things that are rewarded, if finely calibrated and thoughtfully applied, I think can spur innovation. There are a number of different ways of doing it. They all should be tried, and we should have take a careful look at what's been successful. And I know that this is one of the missions of the Florence School of Regulation. And so I have some hope that that regulatory incentives that reward, that give cheese to the mouse and get the mouse to go in the direction we want will help a lot in the future, as well as having people working for utilities who aren't simply looking for a nice paycheck for 30 or 40 years and then a retirement.
I think now we have a few more questions, but we also would like the audience to put some questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and then Jean-Michel will answer some of those questions. But before we get there, I feel we are in a situation where we have the need for security of supply in the synchronized system, where that is a common good with the security of supply all over. And we talk about the distribution grid in a system where a lot will be decentralized and a lot of the changes will happen at the lower grid level. Do you have any thoughts about these kind of centralization, decentralization, which I believe is applicable both in the US and Europe and worldwide for that matter?
Yeah, that's correct. So the revolutions aren't over. What we're seeing now with centralized wind, mainly but not entirely centralized solar, and centralized batteries may not be what is best for the grid or what is most economic. This has been a wonderful field to work in part because every 5 to 10 years, something entirely new in terms of technology or economics or public environmental priorities comes up. So I thought I would work in this field for a decade and then move on to something else. And here I am, almost 50 years later, still working in electric power. I think it is quite conceivable that in the 2030s and 2040s, that most supply additions will be distributed, that finally the dream of St. Fred's will be realized in terms of very active demand side, and that as a result, we'll see a very different decentralized grid than what Thomas Edison or George Westinghouse or Nicholas Tesla imagined. Maybe we'll see DC-based distribution grids, for example. These things are all possible. Think of the surprises that we've seen in the last half century, and I don't know that that's a mainly distributed system would be any bigger of a change than what we've already seen in our conversion from a mainly coal-based thermal system in the 50s to through nuclear, through the dash to gas, and now to renewables and batteries. So who knows what's in store? So I'm not going to predict one future or the other. I just know that it's going to be different than what we have now, and perhaps very different from what we can imagine. So this actually goes back to a question you asked, Astrid, that I deftly avoided answering, which was about adaptation. When you build a transmission line, you're talking about an asset that will last also a half century or 60 years, and may be serving a very different set of needs, a very different system than it is today. So I think it's important to design our grids with adaptability in mind. For example, what if we just had two scenarios for, say, 2040? One scenario where most of the that scale economies remain strong in wind and solar, and it's mainly centralized facilities distributing over the high voltage grid and then down to the consumer, versus another scenario of a mainly distributed future. Imagine that we said those were equally likely. We should consider both possibilities when we make investments in the grids today. So we should avoid putting all our bets, all our euros or shekels or kroner on one of the futures. We should design a system that can adapt to the other one if the other one occurs. And there are ways to think carefully about that and to come up with design short-term sets of investments that will, like the goalie being in the middle of the goal, maximize your chances of success and avoiding waste of money and resources later on. So thanks for all your questions, Astrid. I hope you have some time for questions from the audience as well, or maybe just some comments. When my mouth is moving up and down, I don't learn anything.
Jean-Michel, there are some questions in the chat.
Yeah, I found the first one saying, okay, Ben, so key are incentives, but what is an appropriate incentive? Is it an incentive targeting directly the costs of the company? Or is it an incentive targeting volumes of particular outputs? And by the way, what kind of outputs do we have to privilege with particular incentive? How do you react, Ben?
So, I think that this, like all the other questions, are really terrific, and each could be a subject of an entire session by itself. Although my knowledge is limited, you should get somebody else like Jean-Michel or Michael who know a lot more about these. But this would be a great agenda. So, where should the incentives be targeted? This is of course, in the last 3 or 4 years, this has been a huge topic of debate in the US. So I'm of the generation that fell in love with emissions trading in the 1990s when that was pioneered in the United States for acid rain precursors for sulfur dioxide. And then in the late 1990s, we thought that under President Obama, we would get carbon trading in the United States. And of course, we had the creation of the ETS in Europe. But now I look at what's happened in the United States, where the notion of a systemic price for carbon is a distant and receding dream. And instead, we have to do something else if we're going to do anything about carbon. And that has resulted in putting incentives on emissions, on performance, which is what you should reward. We don't care how you lower emissions. We just want you to do it cheaply. Instead, with industrial policy, the incentives are being put on inputs. That is, what you build. So particular technologies each get their tax credits or grants or something else. And we used to derisively refer to that as choosing winners. And it should make every economist shiver. But politics is the art of the possible. Something needs to be done about carbon. And if it could be that industrial policy will be a horribly inefficient way of doing it, as the cover story of an economist last month argued. Or it could be that industrial policy will be an engine of innovation that emissions allowances could never stimulate. I am an engineer and mathematician by inclination, and I'm not an economist, so I won't try to answer whether that's the case. But in general, your incentives could be on performance, however measured, efficiency, volume of outputs, of course, frequency of interruption, prices, aggregate costs. They could be incentives for inputs. Again, that makes many economists shudder, but that is what was possible. The squeeze, we had one vote in the Senate, and if we got that one vote, we would have a carbon bill. And this is the thing that we could get through the eye of the needle, which is the industrial policy, which is directed at inputs. And I just hope that policies will be effective enough that in the future we can increase incentives that address outputs and lower the reliance on incentives on inputs. There are people who know much more about incentive-based regulation, for example, for distribution utilities, whether based on operating costs or capital costs and various measures of efficiency. And again, I would refer you to the Cambridge Group and others who have been looking at this and have a lot of wonderful ideas. And I'll be looking at those too.
Okay. Somebody else is saying, you emphasized that co-planning of transmission and generation would tremendously help facing some blockade. very visible in the US. But is it the only possibility, or do you know, or do you imagine other policy being able to tackle the very same blockade?
So there are examples of it having been done and successful in the past. And of course, planning is never about creating the right model, solving it, and then announcing the solution. Rather, the way to use a model is to gain insights, to learn things about, what sort of possibilities look attractive and are worthy of further discussion. Are there any surprises? So a systems model might suggest some things that you haven't thought of, but you never just take the answer. It becomes an input, one input to a planning process. So the Mid-Continent ISO had something called the most value process, MVP, where eventually at the end of the process, MISO said, these are the 17 lines that we think that as a package will prepare MISO for a future of large amounts of wind in the West and delivering it to the markets. For example, Chicago, where Jean-Michel is now shivering in the cold. And these were spread out over the system enough that everybody saw benefits. And as a result, when you went to go get permits, it wasn't my state of South Dakota saying, why are you picking on us? Why are you putting a line through us and not through the neighbor? But rather you could see it was part of the whole and part of burden sharing, and something that also, for example, during that freeze in February 2021, is something that gave a lot of benefits to South Dakota when power got moved the other way. Instead of from South Dakota wind east, from eastern power plants west. So the key thing is in co-optimization, you're anticipating how your grid configuration might affect the attractiveness of different areas for development of generation. You are picking and choosing in the sense that in northeastern South Dakota and not southeastern South Dakota is really the best place from the power system and from the resource and from the environmental point of view to put the circuits. So we're going to put the circuits there, and that will accommodate such and such amount of development. And the developments that were proposed for southeast South Dakota, sorry, that's just not going to happen. It is not the ISO that decides this, though. It is some sort of public process that involves the states who have the most power on making siting and permitting decisions in the United States. And so where people feel like that they're partners in this and that it's the whole system. Then co-optimization is useful for insights to make planning decisions more informed, to make you more confident that you're making a decision that's economic, that will be robust to future uncertainties and addresses most concerns. Somebody once said that models are for insight and not numbers. Well, we do need numbers. We need to say where the line will go or which power plant we need to turn on. But in a planning context, you really need something that will help teach not just the planners, but the public and stakeholders what the trade-offs are and what the risks are, and raise everybody's understanding so the decision is something that can be bought into. And in the case of MISO, 16 out of the 17 lines were approved, which is absolutely amazing. I'm not going to say that you'll have 95% success all the time if you do something like this. But co-optimization modeling can help contribute to an informed process that will, I hope, have good outcomes.
The next is starting from the same point, but making it a bit more difficult to handle. Usually, in an energy system, we think how to get the most efficient energy mix at each time. And we know that it will come with transmission. So it is a couple energy mix and transmission that we have to use to get efficiency. But these days, or the coming days, storage can be as important as transmission and generation. Flexibility of electric vehicles can be as important as the rest. And by the way, Norway is a leading world country for electricity vehicles adoption. And centralization versus decentralization is also key, because if we have more decentralized assets, resources, etc., we will be able to create local, very efficient electricity systems. So what is become the study of efficient electricity systems?
Sorry, Jean-Michel, can you say the last sentence again?
Yeah.
What
What is become the study, the science of efficient electricity systems?
What has become the science of efficient electricity systems? So you mentioned a couple of things that absolutely are important to mention, that it's not just transmission, which moves power over space, but it's storage that moves power over time that's going to be increasingly important. Although in the Northwest US, and of course in Nord Pool, we've always known that. Flexibility, especially on the demand side. I'd like to say that, yeah, Norway is #1 for electric vehicles. I have my second vehicle thanks to my daughter, who totaled my first electric vehicle. That's a toy that she didn't take good care of. So what has become this science of efficient electricity is that I've talked about models, and I've talked about markets, and models in a centralized kind of planning, collaborative planning way, but at the same time, markets and where individual market participants are putting their money at risk, and taking chances, and so that focuses attention, and they're also using these models. So I think both centralized and decentralized processes will remain important in the future for this utility. The one thing as an engineer that I love about electricity is that no industry uses optimization as much and to as good effect as the electric power industry. So I tell all my students to take mathematics and economics. I think we might be at the top of the hour.
We are. We have to end. I have to deeply thank both of you. You have seen, audience, that an electrical engineer and a lawyer at a TSO company can help us to understand the challenges we face, the options we have, and you see that we are far from being left with no capabilities. We can act, we can react, and I will add, having women on board is absolutely needed. We have to face everything on earth together. Alleluia, alleluia, et alleluia.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. Thank you, Ben. Very interesting. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.